Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to our latest Patreon member, David. David, thank you so much for your support. It helps make this podcast possible, and it's much appreciated. If you're interested in learning about the perks available to subscribers, including monthly episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to the Patreon page in the show description, along with other ways you can support this podcast. I hope you take a moment to check them out. Now, let's get to the reading. Tonight, we're returning once more to one of your favorites and mine, the Book of Household Management, comprising information for the mistress, housekeeper, cook, kitchen maid, butler, footman, coachman, valet, upper and under housemaids, lady's maid, maid of all work, laundry maid, nurse and nursemaid, monthly, wet and sick nurses, etc., etc. Also sanitary, medical, and legal memoranda, with a history of the origin, properties, and uses of all things connected with home life and comfort, by Mrs. Isabella Beeton. Published originally by S.O. Beeton in 24 monthly parts, 1859 to 1861. First published in a bound edition in 1861. This evening we'll be heading into the kitchen. Let's begin. Chapter 3: Arrangement and Economy of the Kitchen. The distribution of a kitchen, says Count Rumford, the celebrated philosopher and physician, who wrote so learnedly on all subjects connected with domestic economy and architecture, must always depend so much on local circumstances that general rules can hardly be given respecting it. The principles, however, on which this distribution ought, in all cases, to be made, are simple and easy to be understood. And in his estimation, these resolve themselves into symmetry of proportion in the building and convenience to the cook. The requisites of a good kitchen, however, demand something more special than is here pointed out. It must be remembered that it is the great laboratory of every household, and that much of the weal or woe, as far as regards bodily health, depends upon the nature of the preparations concocted within its walls. A good kitchen, therefore, should be erected with a view to the following particulars. 1. Convenience of distribution in its parts, with largeness of dimension. 2. Excellence of light, height of ceiling, and good ventilation. 3. Easiness of access, without passing through the house. 4. Sufficiently remote from the principal apartments of the house, that the members, visitors, or guests of the family may not perceive the odor incident to cooking, or hear the noise of culinary operations. 5. Plenty of fuel and water, which, with the scullery, pantry, and storeroom, should be so near it as to offer the smallest possible trouble in reaching them. The kitchens of the Middle Ages in England are said to have been constructed after the fashion of those of the Romans. They were generally octagonal, with several fireplaces, but no chimneys. Neither was there any wood admitted into the building. The accompanying cut, Figure 1, represents the turret which was erected on the top of the conical roof of the kitchen at Glastonbury Abbey, and which was perforated with holes to allow the smoke of the fire, as well as the steam from cooking, to escape. Some kitchens had funnels or vents below the eaves to let out the steam, which was sometimes considerable, as the Anglo-Saxons used their meat chiefly in a boiled state. From this circumstance, some of their large kitchens had 4 ranges, comprising a boiling place for small boiled meats, and a boiling house for the great boiler. In private houses, the culinary arrangements were no doubt different, for Ducang mentions a little kitchen with a chamber, even in a solarium or upper floor. The simplicity of the primitive ages has frequently been an object of poetical admiration, and it delights the imagination to picture men living upon such fruits as spring spontaneously from the earth, and desiring no other beverages to slake their thirst but such as fountains and rivers supply. Thus we are told that the ancient inhabitants of Argos lived principally on pears, that the Arcadians reveled in acorns, and the Athenians in figs. This, of course, was in the Golden Age, before plowing began, and when mankind enjoyed all kinds of plenty without having to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. This delightful period, however, could not last forever, and the earth became barren and continued unfruitful till Ceres came and taught the art of sowing with several other useful inventions. The first whom she taught to till the ground was Triptolemus, who communicated his instructions to his countrymen the Athenians. Thence the art was carried into Achaia, and thence into Arcadia. Barley was the first grain that was used, and the invention of bread-making is ascribed to Pan. The use of fire as an instrument of cookery must have been coeval with this invention of bread, which, being the most necessary of all kinds of foods, was frequently used in a sense so comprehensive as to include both meat and drink. It was by the Greeks baked under the ashes. In the primary ages, it was deemed unlawful to eat flesh, and when mankind began to depart from their primitive habits, the flesh of swine was the first that was eaten. For several ages it was pronounced unlawful to slaughter oxen, from an estimate of their great value in assisting men to cultivate the ground. Nor was it usual to kill young animals, from a sentiment which considered it cruel to take away the life of those that had scarcely tasted the joys of existence. At this period no cooks were kept, and we know from Homer that his ancient heroes prepared and dressed their victuals with their own hands. Ulysses, for example, we are told, like a modern charwoman, excelled at lighting a fire, whilst Achilles was an adept at turning a spit. Subsequently, heralds employed in civil and military affairs filled the office of cooks and managed marriage feasts. But this, no doubt, was after mankind had advanced in the art of living a step further than roasting, which in all places was the ancient manner of dressing meat. The age of roasting we may consider as that in which the use of the metals would be introduced as adjuncts to the culinary art. And amongst these, iron, the most useful of them all, would necessarily take a prominent place. This metal is easily oxidized, but to bring it to a state of fusibility, it requires a most intense heat. Of all the metals, it is the widest diffused and most abundant, and few stones or mineral bodies are without an admixture of it. It possesses the valuable property of being welded by hammering, and hence its adaptation to the numerous purposes of civilized life. Metallic grains of iron have been found in strawberries, and 1/12 of the weight of the wood of dried oak is said to consist of this metal. Blood owes its color of redness to the quantity of iron it contains, and rain and snow are seldom perfectly free from it. In the arts, it is employed in 3 states, as cast iron, wrought iron, and steel. In each of these, it largely enters into the domestic economy, and stoves, grates, and the general implements of cookery are usually composed of it. In antiquity, its employment was, comparatively speaking, equally universal. The excavations made at Pompeii have proved this. The accompanying cuts present us with specimens of stoves, both ancient and modern. Figure 2 is the remains of a kitchen stove found in the house of Pansa at Pompeii, and would seem in its perfect state not to have been materially different from such as are in use at the present day. Figure 3 is a self-acting, simple open range in modern use, and may be had of 2 qualities, ranging according to their dimensions from £3 10 shillings and £3 18 shillings respectively, up to £4 10 shillings and £7 5 shillings. They are completely fitted up with oven, boiler, sliding cheek, wrought iron bars, revolving shelves, and brass tap. Figure 4 is called the improved Leamington Kitchener, and is said to surpass any other range in use for easy cooking by one fire. It has a hot plate, which is well calculated for an ironing stove, and on which as many vessels as will stand upon it may be kept boiling without being either soiled or injured. Besides, it has a perfectly ventilated and spacious wrought iron roaster with movable shelves, draw-out stand, double dripping pan, and meat stand. The roaster can be converted into an oven by closing the valves, when bread and pastry can be baked in it in a superior manner. It also has a large iron boiler with brass tap and steam pipe, round and square gridirons for chops and steaks, ash pan, open fire for roasting, and a set of ornamental covings with plate warmer attached. It took a first-class prize and medal in the Great Exhibition of 1851, and was also exhibited with all the recent improvements at the Dublin exhibition in 1853. Figure 5 is another Kitchener, adapted for large families. It has on the one side a large ventilated oven, and on the other the fire and roaster. The hot plate is over all, and there is a back boiler made of wrought iron with brass tap and steam pipe. In other respects it resembles figure 4, with which it possesses similar advantages of construction. Either may be had at varying prices according to size, from £5 15 shillings up to £23 10 shillings. They are supplied by Messrs. Richard and John Slack, 336 The Strand, London. From kitchen ranges to the implements used in cookery is but a step. With these, every kitchen should be well supplied, otherwise the cook must not be expected to perform her office in a satisfactory manner. Of the culinary utensils of the ancients, our knowledge is very limited, but as the art of living in every civilized country is pretty much the same, the instruments for cooking must, in a great degree, bear a striking resemblance to each other. On referring to classical antiquities, we find mentioned among household utensils leather bags, baskets constructed of twigs, reeds, and rushes, boxes, basins, and bellows, bread molds, brooms, and brushes, cauldrons, colanders, cisterns, and chafing dishes, cheese rasps, knives and ovens of the Dutch kind, funnels and frying pans, hand mills, soup ladles, milk pails, and oil jars, presses, scales and sieves, spits of different sizes, but some of them large enough to roast an ox, spoons, fire tongs, trays, and trenchers, drinking vessels, with others for carrying food, preserving milk, and holding cheese. This enumeration, if it does nothing else, will to some extent indicate the state of the simpler kinds of mechanical arts among the ancients. In so far as regards the shape and construction of many of the kitchen utensils enumerated above, they bore a great resemblance to our own. This will be seen by the accompanying cuts. Figure 6 is an ancient stock pot in bronze, which seems to have been made to hang over the fire, and was found in the buried city of Pompeii. Figure 7 is one of modern make, and may be obtained either of copper or wrought iron, tinned inside. Figure 8 is another of antiquity, with a large ladle and colander, with holes attached. It is taken from the Column of Trajan. The modern ones can be obtained at all prices, according to size, from 13 shillings 6 up to £1 1 shilling. In the manufacture of these utensils, bronze metal seems to have been much in favor with the ancients. It was chosen not only for their domestic vessels, but it was also much used for their public sculptures and medals. It is a compound composed of from 6 to 12 parts of tin to 100 of copper. It gives its name to figures and all pieces of sculpture made from it. Brass was another favorite metal, which is composed of copper and zinc. It is much more fusible than copper, and not so apt to tarnish. In a pure state, it is not malleable unless when hot, and after it has been melted twice, it will not bear the hammer. To render it capable of being wrought, it requires 7 pounds of lead to be put to 100 weight of its own material. The Corinthian brass of antiquity was a mixture of silver, gold, and copper. A fine kind of brass, supposed to be made by the cementation of copper plates with calamine, is in Germany hammered out into leaves and is called Dutch metal in this country. It is employed in the same way as gold leaf. Brass is much used for watchworks as well as for wire. The braziers, ladles, stewpans, saucepans, gridirons, and colanders of antiquity might generally pass for those of the English manufacture of the present day, in so far as shape is concerned. In proof of this, we have placed together the following similar articles of ancient and modern pattern, in order that the reader may, at a single view, see wherein any difference that is between them consists. Figures 9 and 10 are flat sauce or sauté pans, the ancient one being fluted in the handle and having at the end a ram's head. Figures 11 and 12 are colanders, the handle of the ancient one being adorned in the original with carved representations of a cornucopia, a satyr, a goat, pigs, and other animals. Any display of taste in the adornment of such utensils might seem to be useless, but when we remember how much more natural it is for us all to be careful of the beautiful and costly than of the plain and cheap, it may even become a question in the economy of a kitchen whether it would not in the long run be cheaper to have articles which displayed some tasteful ingenuity in their manufacture than such as are so perfectly plain as to have no attractions whatever beyond their mere suitableness to the purposes for which they are made. Figures 13 and 14 are saucepans, the ancient one being of bronze, originally copied from the cabinet of Monsieur l'Abbé Charlet and engraved in the antiquities of Maupassant. Figures 15 and 17 are gridirons, and 16 and 18 dripping pans. In all these utensils, the resemblance between such as were in use 2,000 years ago and those in use at the present day is strikingly manifest. Some of the ancient utensils represented in the above cuts are copied from those found amid the ruins of Herculaneum and Pompeii. These Roman cities were, in the 1st century, buried beneath the lava of an eruption of Vesuvius, and continued to be lost to the world till the beginning of the last century, when a peasant in digging for a well gradually discovered a small temple with some statues. Little notice, however, was taken of this circumstance till 1736, when the King of Naples, desiring to erect a palace at Portici, caused extensive excavations to be made, when the city of Herculaneum was slowly unfolded to view. Pompeii was discovered about 1750, and being easier cleared from the lava in which it had so long been entombed, disclosed itself as it existed immediately before the catastrophe which overwhelmed it nearly 2,000 years ago. It presented to the modern world the perfect picture of the form and structure of an ancient Roman city. The interior of its habitations, shops, baths, theaters, and temples were all disclosed, with many of the implements used by the workmen in their various trades and the materials on which they were employed when the doomed city was covered with the Lavian stream. Amongst the most essential requirements of the kitchen are scales or weighing machines for family use. These are found to have existed among the ancients and must at a very early age have been both publicly and privately employed for the regulation of quantities. The modern English weights were adjusted by the 27th chapter of Magna Carta, or the Great Charter forced by the barons from King John at Runnymede in Surrey. Therein it is declared that the weights all over England shall be the same, although for different commodities there were two different kinds, Troy and avoirdupois. The origin of both is taken from a grain of wheat gathered in the middle of an ear. The standard of measures was originally kept at Winchester, and by a law of King Edgar was ordained to be observed throughout the kingdom. Figure 19 is an ancient pair of common scales, with two basins and a movable weight, which is made in the form of a head covered with the peleus, because Mercury had the weights and measures under his superintendence. It is engraved on a stone in the Gallery of Florence. Figure 20 represents a modern weighing machine of great convenience and generally in use in those establishments where a great deal of cooking is carried on. Accompanying the scales or weighing machines, there should be spice boxes and sugar and biscuit canisters of either white or japanned tin. The covers of these should fit tightly in order to exclude the air, and if necessary be lettered in front to distinguish them. The white metal of which they are usually composed loses its color when exposed to the air, but undergoes no further change. It enters largely into the composition of culinary utensils, many of them being entirely composed of tinned sheet iron, the inside of copper and iron vessels also being usually what is called tinned. This art consists of covering any metal with a thin coating of tin, and it requires the metal to be covered, to be perfectly clean and free from rust, and also that the tin itself be purely metallic and entirely cleared from all ashes or refuse. Copper boilers, saucepans, and other kitchen utensils are tinned after they are manufactured, by being first made hot and the tin rubbed on with resin. In this process, nothing ought to be used but pure grain tin. Lead, however, is sometimes mixed with that metal, not only to make it lie more easily, but to adulterate it. A pernicious practice, which in every article connected with the cooking and preparation of food cannot be too severely reprobated. The following list, supplied by Messrs. Richard and John Slack, 336 The Strand, will show the articles required for the kitchen of a family in the middle class of life, although it does not contain all the things that may be deemed necessary for some families, and may contain more than are required for others. As Messrs. Slack themselves, however, publish a useful illustrated catalogue which may be had at their establishment gratis, and which it will be found advantageous to consult by those about to furnish, it supersedes the necessity of our enlarging that which we give. 1 tea kettle, 1 toasting fork, 1 bread grater, 1 pair of brass candlesticks, 1 teapot and tray, 1 bottle jack, 6 spoons, 2 candlesticks, 1 candle box, 6 knives and forks, 2 sets of skewers, 1 meat chopper, 1 cinder sifter, 1 coffee pot, 1 colander, 3 block tin saucepans, 5 iron saucepans, 1 ditto and steamer, 1 large boiling pot, 4 iron stew pans, 1 dripping pan and stand, 1 dustpan, 1 fish and egg slice, 2 fish kettles, 1 flour box, 3 flat irons, 2 frying pans, 1 gridiron, 1 mustard pot, 1 salt cellar, 1 pepper box, 1 pair of bellows, 3 jelly molds, 1 plate basket, 1 cheese toaster, 1 coal shovel, and 1 wood meat screen. For the set, £8, 11 shillings, and 1 pence. As not only health but life may be said to depend on the cleanliness of culinary utensils, great attention must be paid to their condition generally, but more especially to that of the saucepans, stewpans, and boilers. Inside they should be kept perfectly clean, and where an open fire is used, the outside as clean as possible. With a Leamington range, saucepans, stewpans, etc. can be kept entirely free from smoke and soot on the outside, which is an immense saving of labor to the cook or scullery maid. Care should be taken that the lids fit tight and close, so that soups or gravies may not be suffered to waste by evaporation. They should be made to keep the steam in and the smoke out, and should always be bright on the upper rim, where they do not immediately come in contact with the fire. Soup pots and kettles should be washed immediately after being used, and dried before the fire, and they should be kept in a dry place in order that they may escape the deteriorating influence of rust and thereby be destroyed. Copper utensils should never be used in the kitchen unless tinned, and the utmost care should be taken not to let the tin be rubbed off. If by chance this should occur, have it replaced before the vessel is again brought into use. Neither soup nor gravy should, at any time, be suffered to remain in them longer than is absolutely necessary, as any fat or acid that is in them may affect the metal, so as to impregnate with poison what is intended to be eaten. Stone and earthenware vessels should be provided for soups and gravies not intended for immediate use, and also plenty of common dishes for the larder, that the table set may not be used for such purposes. It is the nature of vegetables soon to turn sour, when they are apt to corrode glazed redware and even metals, and frequently thereby to become impregnated with poisonous particles. The vinegar also in pickles by its acidity does the same. Consideration, therefore, should be given to these facts, and great care also taken that all sieves, jelly bags, and tapes for collared articles be well scalded and kept dry, or they will impart an unpleasant flavor when next used. To all these directions the cook should pay great attention, nor should they by any means be neglected by the mistress of the household, who ought to remember that cleanliness in the kitchen gives health and happiness to home, whilst economy will immeasurably assist in preserving them. Without fuel, a kitchen might be pronounced to be of little use. Therefore, to discover and invent materials for supplying us with the means of domestic heat and comfort has exercised the ingenuity of man. Those now known have been divided into 5 classes. The first comprehending the fluid inflammable bodies, the second peat or turf, the third charcoal of wood, the fourth pit coal charred, and the fifth wood or pit coal in a crude state, with the capacity of yielding a copious and bright flame. The first may be said seldom to be employed for the purposes of cookery, but peat, especially amongst rural populations, has in all ages been regarded as an excellent fuel. It is one of the most important productions of an alluvial soil, and belongs to the vegetable rather than the mineral kingdom. It may be described as composed of wet, spongy black earth held together by decayed vegetables. Formerly it covered extensive tracts in England, but has greatly disappeared before the genius of agricultural improvement. Charcoal is a kind of artificial coal, used principally where a strong and clear fire is desired. It is a black, brittle, insoluble, inodorous, tasteless substance, and when newly made, possesses the remarkable property of absorbing certain quantities of the different gases. Its dust, when used as a polishing powder, gives great brilliancy to metals. It consists of wood half burned, and is manufactured by cutting pieces of timber into nearly the same size, then disposing them in heaps and covering them with earth, so as to prevent communication with the air, except when necessary to make them burn. When they have been sufficiently charred, the fire is extinguished by stopping the vents through which the air is admitted. Of coal there are various species, as pit, comb, slate, cannel, Kilkenny, sulphurous, bovey, jet, etc. These have all their specific differences and are employed for various purposes, but are all more or less used as fuel. The use of coal for burning purposes was not known to the Romans. In Britain it was discovered about 50 years before the birth of Christ in Lancashire, not far from where Manchester now stands. but for ages after its discovery, so long as forests abounded, wood continued to be the fuel used for firing. The first public notice of coal is in the reign of Henry III, who in 1272 granted a charter to the town of Newcastle, permitting the inhabitants to dig for coal. It took some centuries more, however, to bring it into common use, as this did not take place till about the first quarter of the 17th century, in the time of Charles I. A few years after the Restoration, we find that about 200,000 cauldrons were consumed in London. Although several countries possess mines of coal, the quality of their mineral is, in general, greatly inferior to that of Great Britain, where it is found mostly in undulating districts abounding with valleys and interspersed with plains of considerable extent. It lies usually between the strata of other substances and rarely in a horizontal position, but with a dip or inclination to one side. Our cut, figure 21, represents a section of coal as it is found in the stratum. To be acquainted with the periods when things are in season is one of the most essential pieces of knowledge which enter into the art of cookery. We have therefore compiled the attached lists, which will serve to show for every month in the year the times when things are in season. When fuel and food are procured, the next consideration is how the latter may be best preserved with a view to its being suitably dressed. More waste is often occasioned by the want of judgment or of necessary care in this particular than by any other cause. In the absence of proper places for keeping provisions, a hanging safe, suspended in an airy situation, is the best substitute. A well-ventilated larder, dry and shady, is better for meat and poultry, which require to be kept for some time, and the utmost skill in the culinary art will not compensate for the want of proper attention to this particular. Though it is advisable that annual food should be hung up in the open air till its fibers have lost some degree of their toughness, yet if it is kept till it loses its natural sweetness, its flavor has become deteriorated, and as a wholesome comestible, it has lost many of its qualities conducive to health. As soon, therefore, as the slightest trace of putrescence is detected, it has reached its highest degree of tenderness and should be dressed immediately. During the sultry summer months, it is difficult to procure meat that is not either tough or tainted. It should therefore be well examined when it comes in, and if flies have touched it, the part must be cut off and the remainder well washed. In very cold weather, meat and vegetables touched by the frost should be brought into the kitchen early in the morning and soaked in cold water. In loins of meat, the long pipe that runs by the bone should be taken out, as it is apt to taint, as also the kernels of beef. Rumps and edge bones of beef, when bruised, should not be purchased. All these things ought to enter into the consideration of every household manager, and great care should be taken that nothing is thrown away or suffered to be wasted in the kitchen, which might, by proper management, be turned to a good account. The shank bones of mutton, so little esteemed in general, give richness to soups or gravies, if well soaked and brushed before they are added to the boiling. They are also particularly nourishing for sick persons. Roast beef bones or shank bones of ham make excellent stock for pea soup. When the whites of eggs are used for jelly, confectionery, or other purposes, a pudding or a custard should be made that the yolks may be used. All things likely to be wanted should be in readiness. Sugars of different sorts, currants washed, picked, and perfectly dry, spices pounded and kept in very small bottles closely corked, or in canisters as we have already directed. Not more of these should be purchased at a time than are likely to be used in the course of a month. Much waste is always prevented by keeping every article in the place best suited to it. Vegetables keep best on a stone floor, if the air be excluded. Meat in a cold, dry place, as also salt, sugar, sweetmeats, candles, dried meats, and hams. Rice and all sorts of seed for puddings should be closely covered to preserve them from insects. But even this will not prevent them from being affected by these destroyers if they are long and carelessly kept. Chapter 4. Introduction to Cookery. As in the fine arts, the progress of mankind from barbarism to civilization is marked by a gradual succession of triumphs over the rude materialities of nature. So in the art of cookery is the progress gradual from the earliest and simplest modes to those of the most complicated and refined. Plain or rudely carved stones, tumuli, or mounds of earth are the monuments by which barbarous tribes denote the events of their history, to be succeeded only in the long course of a series of ages by beautifully proportioned columns, gracefully sculptured statues, triumphal arches, coins, medals, and the higher efforts of the pencil and the pen, as man advances by culture and observation to the perfection of his facilities. So is it with the art of cookery. Man in his primitive state lives upon roots and the fruits of the earth, until by degrees he is driven to seek for new means by which his wants may be supplied and enlarged. He then becomes a hunter and a fisher. As his species increases, greater necessities come upon him, when he gradually abandons the roving life of the savage for the more stationary pursuits of the herdsman. These beget still more settled habits, when he begins the practice of agriculture, forms ideas of the rights of property, and has his own both defined and secured. The forest, the stream, and the sea are now no longer his only resources for food. He sows and he reaps, pastures and breeds cattle, lives on the cultivated produce of his fields, and revels in the luxuries of the dairy, raises flocks for clothing, and assumes to all intents and purposes the habits of permanent life and the comfortable condition of a farmer. This is the fourth stage of social progress, up to which the useful or mechanical arts have been incidentally developing themselves when trade and commerce begin. Through these various phases, only to live has been the great object of mankind, but by and by comforts are multiplied, and accumulating riches create new wants. The object, then, is not only to live, but to live economically, agreeably, tastefully, and well. Accordingly, the art of cookery commences, and although the fruits of the earth, the fowls of the air, the beasts of the field, and the fish of the sea are still the only food of mankind, yet these are so prepared, improved, and dressed by skill and ingenuity that they are the means of immeasurably extending the boundaries of human enjoyments. Everything that is edible and passes under the hands of the cook is more or less changed and assumes new forms. Hence, the influence of that functionary is immense upon the happiness of a household. In order that the duties of the cook may be properly performed, and that he may be able to reproduce esteemed dishes with certainty, all terms of indecision should be banished from his art. Accordingly, what is known only to him will in these pages be made known to others. In them, all these indecisive terms expressed by a bit of this, some of that, a small piece of that, and a handful of the other shall never be made use of, but all quantities be precisely and explicitly stated, with a desire also that all ignorance on this most essential part of the culinary art should disappear, and that a uniform system of weights and measures should be adopted. We give an account of the weights which answer to certain measures. A tablespoonful is frequently mentioned in a recipe, in the prescriptions of medical men, and also in medical, chemical, and gastronomical works. By it is generally meant and understood a measure or bulk equal to that which would be produced by half an ounce of water. A dessert spoonful is the half of a tablespoonful. That is to say, by it is meant a measure or bulk equal to 1/4 of an ounce of water. A teaspoonful is equal in quantity to 1 dram of water. A drop is the name of a vague kind of measure, and is so called on account of the liquid being dropped from the mouth of a bottle. Its quantity, however, will vary, either from the consistency of the liquid or the size and shape of the mouth of the bottle. The College of Physicians determined the quantity of a drop to be 1 grain, 60 drops making 1 fluid dram. Their drop, or 60th part of a fluid dram, is called a minim. Graduated glass measures can be obtained at any chemist's, and they save much trouble. One of these, containing a wine pint, is divided into 16 ounces, and the ounce into 8 drams of water, by which any certain weight mentioned in a recipe can be accurately measured out. Homemade measures of this kind can readily be formed by weighing the water contained in any given measure and marking on any tall glass the space it occupies. This mark can easily be made with a file. It will be interesting to many readers to know the basis on which the French found their system of weights and measures, for it certainly possesses the grandeur of simplicity. The meter, which is the basis of the whole system of French weights and measures, is the exact measurement of 1/40,000,000th part of a meridian of the earth. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Book of Household Management by Mrs. Isabella Beeton. I confess, I could keep reading this book forever. I love it so much. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, contact me on our website at www.boringbookspod.com or catch me on Twitter at boringbookspod. I'd love to hear from you. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.